Robots are infiltrating our lives slowly and steadily. In the morning, Alexa tells me the forecast, while the Roomba follows my vacuuming instructions. My automobile asks where do I want to go and drives me to the house where my elderly father lives quite happily with Paro, his pet robot seal. Back at home, Curie, my intelligent companion robot, checks up on the kids and tells the dog to get off the sofa. These are all examples of artificial intelligence that operate in our everyday lives now. They may not look human yet, but that will change. Already, there's a nascent industry of soft polymer robots created solely for sexual pleasure, men, women, and children. And last summer, in July 2017, the world's first brothel, staffed entirely by robot sex workers, opened in Barcelona, Spain, and the company says it plans to open outlets across the globe. Westworld just may not be as far-fetched as we think. Our guests tonight have been thinking about human-robot relations for years, about the ramifications for the law, for ethical standards, for our privacy, and even for our psychological welfare. We will hear from each of them briefly, then they will enjoy a lively conversation, and then lastly, you'll be able to ask questions. So to get things rolling, please join me in welcoming our wonderful moderator, Emily Dreyfuss.
Hello. Can you guys hear me? Okay, so I am right now a Nieman Fellow at Harvard, but normally I am a writer at Wired, and I live here in Boston, but Wired is located in San Francisco. So as part of my job, I have a Telepresence robot in San Francisco that I use to go to meetings, and when I was managing people, I would have interactions with my team and inspire them. And I bring that up because telepresence robots are something that are even more ever-present, perhaps, than humanoid robots like this. And though some would take issue with the notion that they're actual robots, because they're not automated, there's not an AI, artificial intelligence, running them. There's actually a human intelligence running them from somewhere else. My interaction with my telepresence robot taught me about how tricky our relationships with these devices can be, even when they're as dumb as a telepresence robot, which is just a stick on the top of a Segway with an iPad for a head. What I learned when I navigate this device through the offices in San Francisco was that after not long, 3 days, 4 days, I developed a really unhealthy relationship with my robot. I named her Mbot, and obviously she was a she because she was me. And I felt, even though she didn't have a body, she was and remains the physical manifestation of me in San Francisco. And what came with that identification was a lot of awkward and tricky behaviors with my coworkers because they were looking at just like this kind of dumb stick with an iPad, and if it would freeze up, they would touch it, or if when you are a telepresence robot, your field of vision is like this much, but you're navigating a room with objects. And so inevitably for the first couple of weeks, I would run into like couches, or windows. The Wired office is very filled with glass boxes, and my Mbot couldn't see that glass, so I would just run smack into walls. And it was kind of embarrassing for me, but it was more upsetting when suddenly some humanoid, real human that I couldn't see, would just lift me up. And from my field of vision in Boston, I was just like, all of my autonomy was gone. I didn't know where they were taking me, who had me. People were they pranked me. It was really sad. And this is as dumb as robots get, is this kind of device. And yet, even with it, I had these feelings. I felt violated when someone would lift me up in San Francisco. I longed to bust my robot out onto the streets of San Francisco because I felt that she was a prisoner. I began thinking that I, as a human, Emily Dreyfuss, who lives in Boston, am free to, like, when work is over, go and have a taco or whatever. But the being that I had been inhabiting all day, who had been helping me navigate all of these rooms and talking to people, the second I logged off, she was just stuck in a corner, sad. And I was like, I really became obsessed with her. I was like, how can I break her out? But she's Condé Nast's property, which is the company that owns Wired. And so I couldn't ask my boss to let me steal her onto the streets. So I actually, like, concocted this entire plan where I was going to just navigate her close enough to the elevator and have one willing accomplice put a Wi-Fi hotspot on her, just like with duct tape. And then we would go out and we would be free. Before that was possible before that could happen, MBOT had a malfunction. It was really, really deeply upsetting. I was in a meeting and talking with people face to face and, like, moving side by side, and then suddenly MBOT, totally outside of my control, just began to have a seizure, and she was like roaming around like this, and people were screaming. And people were IMing me like, stop, you're hitting things. But it wasn't me. And first of all, it was a lesson in, like, what can happen when you lose control of your body, which I was actually pregnant at the time that this happened, and I thought of this event when I was giving birth a few months later, and I was like, my body is outside of my control, in the same way that MBOT had been. But that was when I really had to face the harsh reality that MBOT is just a device and not a human and not an extension of my humanity. And it was really upsetting. Anyways, as a result of that experience, I made this video, which I'm going to play you now, which is just an etiquette video for interacting with these kinds of robots. And this is just to get our conversation started. We're going to talk about robots that are far more advanced and robots that we can have intimate relationships with that are not this sort of self-identification intimacy, but rather an intimacy wherein we interact with people. But if you come across a robot like mine, like MBOT, in one of your offices or everyday lives, this is a video that may be instructive for how to interact with it.
It's weird to be a robot in an office, but it's just as weird to have to interact with one. You can't shake their hand, you can't grab a cup of coffee. They might fall over on you or freeze up while you're talking to them. But robot coworkers are going to become more and more common in the near future, so we all need to learn how to get along. After living as a robot employee for a few months, here's some etiquette tips I've learned.
There you go. You had something on your nose.
Well, that'll be in the video, so thanks, Marcus.
My pleasure.
First, rules for humans with robot coworkers. This machine is a physical extension of your real coworker, so don't do anything to it that you wouldn't do to that person in real life. Don't inappropriately touch a robot. Would you pick up your coworker without asking them? No. So don't do that to their robot either. Also a no-no, shaking it, pushing it, or generally touching it at all without asking. Don't sneak up on a robot.
Family. So I'm thinking about that story.
Your coworker doesn't have eyes in the back of her robot head, and she barely has peripheral vision. So don't approach her from behind and start talking. Where are you? Wait, who is this?
I'm over here.
Move to the front where she can see you.
Oh, there you are. Hey!
Okay, cool. Hold on, let me get taller. And before you launch into a face-to-face meeting, let your coworker grow a little taller so they're looking at your eyes and not at your belt.
Oh, hey! Hey!
Hey. Sorry.
Now we're on the same level.
Rules for robots. Ask for help when you need it, but don't be a burden. Your robot may get stuck in the Wi-Fi dead zone. Its microphone may go dead. You may get lost or fall over. In these moments, there's no such thing as pride. Ask for help, but don't force your coworkers to become constant robot babysitters. Thank you.
No problem.
Don't interrupt. Your remote robot may have a slight lag, causing you to interrupt everyone in meetings. Calibrate so that you don't alienate your humans.
Crit for you.
Yes, she is. Hey, Delina.
Oh my god.
Oh, sorry. Don't sneak up on humans. Just as it's rude for a human being to stand silently behind somebody's desk, watching what they type and listening to their phone calls, robots too should refrain from this kind of creepiness. Since your robot doesn't make much noise as you roll by, make a habit of saying hello to your coworkers so they hear you approach.
Whoa.
God damn it. You're not supposed to sneak up on a robot.
You snuck up on me, to be fair.
I mean, I always sneak up. I always think it's louder than it is.
Here, follow the coffee. You want some coffee?
Oh, God, yes.
Nice coffee.
So some of the things that video covers is consent with robots, which as robots become sex objects and objects of intimacy is an issue that we'll talk about and we'll have to face as a society. And with that, I will bring up Kate Darling, who is a researcher at MIT. Thank you.
Wow, what a great introduction to this topic. So the reason that I think this conversation that we're having today is so important is because we're really seeing robots move from being kind of behind the scenes in factories and whatnot into all of these new areas where they're interacting with people. And the thing that I love about human-robot interaction is that we tend to treat robots like they're alive, even though we know that they're. So whether that's like Emily experiencing a robot as kind of an extension of your own person or of your own body, or whether that's a physical robot that's autonomous and on its own, we tend to anthropomorphize these machines, and it's in part because we're primed by science fiction and pop culture to really want to personify these devices, but there's also this deeper biological aspect to it where it seems like we're biologically hardwired to want to treat things that move autonomously in our physical space like they have agency and intent to their movements. So, people will do this with, really dumb technology like Emily was talking about, like sticks on wheels. People will want to attribute agency to. People will name their Roombas and feel bad for the Roomba when it gets stuck in the carpet. The United States military has had all of these issues with soldiers becoming really emotionally attached to the robots that they work with. So, even with very, very simple technology, we see this. And then what we're seeing now also is like increasingly robots that are designed to make us do this, to make us anthropomorphize them. And so I brought a friend with me today. This is Mr. Spaghetti. And this is basically a toy from 2007. But I think it's a really cool example for a robot that people, it's just so well designed that children, adults, everyone tends to treat these guys like they're alive. Here we go, he's waking up. And so we can play with him during the panel, and people can come up and play with him afterwards if you want. But so part of why I think it's so cool that we are developing this technology that people treat like a living thing is because there are already some really cool applications, for example, in health and education for this stuff. So we have robots that are able to work with autistic children and engage them as a communication bridge to teachers or their parents in a way that we haven't been able to engage them previously. Or you have this teddy bear in the Boston Children's Hospital that is a bridge of communication between doctors and children in what is sometimes a really scary situation. And you have things like the robot seal that Lisa mentioned in our introduction that is being used as a replacement for animal therapy in nursing homes, which is really kind of awesome. And of course, sex robots are something that I'm excited about as well, because there are cool applications for sex robots too. So I'm really excited about some of the potential of this technology, but I think what we want to talk about today are also some of the concerns that we have. And some of my concerns, as we increasingly interact with this really lifelike machinery, is how it can impact people's behavior in unintentional ways. So for example, if you have children interacting with these robots, I don't want to be a tech alarmist or anything, but there might be certain habits that develop in how they interact with things that translate to how they interact with people or with animals. And those could be good habits that they develop, or they could be bad habits. Again, what I'm worried about is some of the unintentional stuff that we're not considering when we design these devices. And then, actually, I'm going to turn him off because he's distracting me a little bit, but we'll turn him back on later. These are like my babies. I have 4 of them at home. All right. So there's stuff like that that worries me. Another more serious issue or an example of a more serious issue, speaking of sex robots, is that we're going to have child-sized sex robots, and we don't know whether we should allow them or not, because we have no idea whether things like that perpetuate and normalize undesirable behavior, or whether that's something that's an outlet for people that actually ends up reducing incidences of real child abuse. And that's something we just have no clue what direction it goes in, and something that we're going to need to answer as a society. And then another thing that worries me is that robots are made by people, or usually by companies. And we live in a capitalist society, and sometimes the interests of companies don't necessarily align with the interests of the general public. So there are a lot of questions around data collection, around privacy. There are even questions around emotional manipulation. And if we're talking about sex robots, what does your sex robot know about you? Is it okay for your sex robot to have in-app purchases? Or is that too manipulative? And I'm really excited to be here today with 2 fantastic people. Emily is a leading tech writer, and I often have the sense, and I know in her case, that tech writers have a better sense of what's going on in the space generally than the people working in technology, because they can see the trends and make connections. And then we have Woody, who is about to come up here. Woody Hartzog, who is one of the world's leading experts on robotics and law and privacy. And I know that he's worked specifically on some of the things that I just mentioned. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation with them here today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Woody Hartzog. I'm a professor of law and computer science at Northeastern University, and I teach primarily in the law school, though I do teach some classes in computer science. And what I wanted to talk to you about tonight was the law and policy surrounding sex robots and largely also anthropomorphized robots that we might have an emotional connection to. And when you start to sort of take a step back and see some of these things, the thing I want to make, the point I want to make in my short comments today is I don't think that the law is even remotely ready for what sex robots are going to be and what anthropomorphized robots that look and act like humans, that interact with humans on a regular basis are going to be. And I want to just put a pin in a few things to mark as we go through this conversation. So the first thing that you do when you're a lawyer is you're taught to compare things that are coming, problems that you face in the future with things that already exist. You say, okay, so if this is going to be a problem in the future, what's the law we have that's most like that problem? And the first thing that I want to bring up is security. So sex robots and anthropomorphized robots that we deal with more generally are going to probably be connected to the internet. And if it's connected to the internet, then it's going to be hackable. And that's going to create a number of different problems, things like beyond just sort of natural data spills. So robots that we're intimate with, not just physically, but emotionally vulnerable to, are going to have lots of finely grained information about us. We are going to let them into the most intimate parts of our lives and into the rooms where they collect information about some of our most intimate pieces of ourselves. And things like imposter attacks are going to be inevitable. And this is really scary to me because the closest analog that we have to anthropomorphized robots is the Internet of Things. And the Internet of Things is, on a good day, a flaming hot mess. And we are connecting everything that we possibly can to the internet right now. Basketballs, wine bottles, underwear, sex toys, all of it's getting connected to the internet. And we frankly have a very poor set of rules governing the security of that information. There's not a lot of motivation by a lot of companies to patch those things. It's very difficult to deliver notices about you need to update this firmware, for example. Things go out of date for a long time and become massive security vulnerabilities, and that's only going to be increased as we sort of export a lot of that technology into machine bodies, which essentially is what a sex robot is going to be, which is going to be, it's going to run a piece of software, some AI, on one of these bodies. So it's going to be nothing short of, I think, a major security headache, and the rules that we have aren't really equipped to deal with it. We don't have a general data security law in the United States, and we now might be the time to think about that. The second thing I wanted to talk about was privacy. So in addition to a security risk, the risk of information, anthropomorphized robots are going to know what makes us tick and have lots of access to data, right? So not just clips of our home and conversations, but have a very fine-grained sense of basically everything about us. And profiles will be created about us, things that guess what makes us tick, what gets us hot, what doesn't turn us on. And all this information is going to be stored somewhere. There are going to need to be some rules about what robots can ask and what they can't. And right now, this is a real problem because the primary way in which we govern privacy right now is through consent. We give you notice, we give you consent, we give you control, right? So to see Mark Zuckerberg testifying last week, the idea was, well, we just want to give you more control. This is what tech companies say all the time. We're just bending over backwards to give you control. The problem with thinking of privacy in terms of control is that it's almost impossible for us to gauge at scale the true risk of disclosing data. Think about all the different transactions you engage in online on any given day. Think about all the different apps that you visit. All of these have risks that are sort of always unfolding and really difficult for us to process individually. These sort of risks are going to be magnified with anthropomorphized robots, and I don't think that the law is ready. The final thing I wanted to bring up before we sit down for a discussion is something that Kate talked about a little bit, which is manipulation. So it's not just that we're exposing ourselves to anthropomorphize robots. And as a matter of fact, the only real way that they're going to work is if we do expose ourselves, right? Otherwise, it defeats the purpose. So the entire point of anthropomorphized robots is to reveal ourselves and to shed all this information to form a meaningful bond. But whenever we form a meaningful bond with anyone, not just machines, but with anyone, that actually leaves us a little bit vulnerable. It leaves us open to influence. And on a person-to-person level, we've sort of calibrated the sense of, oh, okay, well, I think I know I can trust you because there are certain things that I know I can trust about a person. There are certain things I value. Maybe because we sort of have this idea that if we trust each other, right, so if we see each other naked, then we're both sort of in this together now. But with robots, it works a little different because it's sort of a one-way street in many ways, and also decisions that are made get exported out at scale. So the people that are designing the robots are going to have an immense amount of power over us because of the emotional attachment that we make to these robots. And I'm here to tell you that the rules that we have about that manipulation are not very clear and they're not very robust. And so you can imagine a scenario whereby we befriend Mr. Spaghetti here, right? And let's say that in future iterations, Mr. Spaghetti learns how to talk and learns how to interact with us, sort of like if Alexa got a personality, right? And we sort of started to think of Mr. Spaghetti as a member of the family, right? We come home from work, we drop our keys off, and we say, Mr. Spaghetti, how was your day? And Mr. Spaghetti says, oh, I was so bored today, or, you know, you should have seen the delivery person came and dropped off a package, and I was just barking like crazy. And so we start to develop these relationships. And then one day, Mr. Spaghetti starts limping. Right? So Mr. Spaghetti's paw sort of hurts, and he starts crawling towards me. And instinctually, I say, oh, Mr. Spaghetti, what's wrong? And Mr. Spaghetti, in his little, sad puppy dog eyes, looks up at me and says, Father, if you don't buy an upgrade for me, I'll die. And of course, I'm going to want to buy an upgrade for Mr. Spaghetti. Who wouldn't? I'm not heartless. And it might be a financially advantageous thing for that company to do. And the rules that we have aren't very good about where that line is drawn and how far companies can go in leveraging our investment in these robots. And so I hope that our other two panelists will join us right now and that we can engage in this conversation a little deeper. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the chat.
What you just said.
Well, first of all, Mr. Spaghetti would never do that.
Well, you were saying that the rules we currently have aren't very robust about this. Do we actually have rules that cover that kind of manipulation? Like what?
In a word, no.
Okay.
Right. So anytime, this is the bad thing of anytime you have a law professor on a panel, because I always say, well, it depends what you mean by X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
So of course we have rules about manipulating people, but they largely occur in advertising context, right?
Okay.
So we've got a series of rules about what commercials are allowed to do. They can't lie to you straight up, right? So a sex robot couldn't promise something that's an outright falsity.
Could it say, I love you?
See, this is where it gets really interesting because it's really difficult to disprove that, right? So like it could say something like, I promise that your data, so if it says something like, I promise your data is safe with me, right? And it turns out
Sexy.
Right, right. I'm a privacy professor, so that's what it is. And so, but then if it turned out that it was storing your wake word, for example, like there's a verbal spoken passcode, and it was storing that, in the open, and that clearly was a falsehood, then there's a clear line there. But in terms of manipulation, we actually don't have really good rules.
Yeah.
This has come up sort of over and over in the field of media. If in the early 1980s, for example, there was a big debate over whether advertising sugary cereals to children was manipulative, because children, of course, are sort of uniquely susceptible. I mean, you see, Cocoa Puffs, and when you're 4, you have to have Cocoa Puffs, right? And so there was a little too much power there. But even those rules sort of petered out, and we don't have a strong sense of. And the hard part is, it's difficult to know where to draw the line.
Yeah,
right.
Because you can think of like Farmville or whatever, or the games like that are not robots, but that really encourage you to pay for in-app purchases. And people who are really sucked in and care about the world they've created are like, I'm really motivated to do that. And does that count as manipulation?
Because we do draw a line somewhere, right? Like there are some things where I think maybe we have more of an illusion of having control over the situation, even though we don't. But then there are things like subliminal advertising where we're like, oh no, that's creepy. We got to ban that. Because that, I think, is outlawed in the States and in most countries, right? Subliminal like when you flash a picture of Coca-Cola so quickly on a movie screen that is just subliminally influences you, but you don't realize it.
But native advertising is fine, where like your TV show just happens to have a storyline where everyone's drinking Snapple.
Yeah.
And they're like, you don't realize it's an ad. And what if your sex robot was just like, the kind of lube I want is KY?
Right.
I mean, like, seriously.
Right. Oh, that is not even a remote possibility. That's absolutely going to happen.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's if you watch the trends, you'll be highly incentivized. To do that.
Because that would be like just a sponsorship deal between like sex robot company X and KY Jelly.
Right.
Right.
And it will allow you. So a lot of it depends upon the business models that we adopt. Because a lot of these robots right now, we don't have set business models. And so you could think of maybe a pay-for-service business model where you didn't have that, or if you had the sort of, freemium version.
Right, where there's just like Pillow Talk is ads.
Right. Yeah, right.
So upsetting.
And then also, to go back to your original point, sort of what if the robot says, I love you?
Yeah.
The additional complication of creating rules prohibiting that is that that's exactly why we want the robot.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about this. I have an Alexa in my house, an Amazon Echo, and I actually tried to tell it that I loved it. I told her I loved her the other day to see what she would say back, and she very carefully was like, that is so sweet of you. And then she goes, you seem like a very nice person too. And I was kind of like, oh, you're really hedging, Alexa. But even Alexa, to take a step back, I mean, we're talking about sex robots, which are like humanoid or sort of robots with bodies that we can interact with and touch or even have intercourse with. But we don't even need the robots to have bodies to have intimacy with them. And these voice-assisted robots that we already have, Google Home, Siri, Alexa, these are already all pervasive. And I was talking to some people the other day about their thoughts of how you interact with them, and a bunch of people mentioned to me how much they feel that they are not alone in their home when they have Alexa there. Like people who work from home or people who live alone. I've heard from so many people who have said, I talk to Alexa when I'm cooking because it makes me less lonely. And this, I'm curious, but what do you guys think are, what are the psychological motivations for having intimacy with these objects?
Oh, gosh. I mean, well, for one thing, I should say, I don't think that having this intimacy with the objects itself is a problem.
Yeah.
Because I do think we're very complicated creatures. Humans,
Yeah.
we're able to have all sorts of relationships. And I feel like when we're talking about AI and robotics, we're often comparing robots to humans, and I don't think that's a good analogy. I think a better analogy is, for example, our relationship with animals that we've had for, throughout history. We've used animals for work and weaponry and companionship, and no one thinks it's weird when you buy a dog, but people think it's weird when you have Alexa as kind of like, they're like, oh, wait, are you replacing your human relationships with this? I don't think that's weird. I think that we have this tendency, and I think we can embrace that to some extent. Where it gets tricky for me is the fact that Alexa is recording everything in my home.
Yeah.
And, you mentioned this earlier. I just want to add to this nightmare scenario that you painted that was already very terrifying, that the internet connectivity and the data collection all like directly enhances the functionality of these
Right.
devices, and I want that functionality. I have an Alexa I have an Echo in my home. I just had a baby. It is so great to be able to like set timers without needing to use your hands and stuff. I want the functionality of a sex robot. I want this functionality, and I can only get that if the robot is collecting data, learning from data, storing the data somewhere. And so it's a huge issue that we don't have an incentive to even try and get better privacy policies.
Right. But it's all hinged on trust, right? I mean, with the way Alexa functions is that supposedly, according to Amazon, the company that makes her or it, it is recording everything that happens in your home, but only to listen for the wake word. And the information that it hears before the wake word is supposedly not sent back to Amazon servers. It's just stored locally on your own device, and then dumped, I guess, until it hears the wake word, and then everything you say after that is recorded. So when I was telling Alexa, I love you, I could then go look at my app, which is recording every interaction I have with Alexa, and it's like, 7:15 a.m. Emily Dreyfuss said, I love you. Which, Amazon has that information. But so much of this is predicated on trust, and it's going to be, as you were saying, I mean, even much more so as we are like having a more involved intimate relationship. What can the law do to bolster that trust? Because right now, I don't know. Right now, we're literally just taking their word for it.
Yeah. So there are several things that the law can do. One of the most important is, so you mentioned that right now Alexa only stores information, listens for the wake word, and the only information that's persistently stored is that sort of 30-second clip, which then gets written over every 30 seconds, right?
Right.
And it's all stored locally. That's not mandated, right? So that was Amazon's choice. But other makers might not be so protective of that information. And so we need rules about the design of information technologies. We need a better sense, not just of how people collect data and use data, because we do have some rules in the United States and coming into effect in Europe, particularly there's a big new law that you may have heard of called the General Data Protection Regulation. It's very formidable, and it's got some interesting rules. But we need better rules about the design of information technologies. But even more importantly than that, and to go back to your earlier question, sort of, is it, per se bad to have a relationship with inanimate technologies? I agree with Kate, I don't think it is. But one of the increased risks of that is that companies are pre-programming these things, right? So they're not spontaneous. All of these decisions are sort of guided, right? And that gives people a power. That gives those companies a power over people, and we don't know what those decisions are. Right. So there are algorithms that are being used and deployed, and they're sort of in a black box. And we don't have a lot of good rules to force that transparency, so that if we wanted to take a look at the source code, which may not tell us much, but at least have some sort of algorithmic accountability, it would be really hard right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when I said I love you and Alexa gave me, her canned response, someone wrote that. There was a meeting that took place where they decided how are we going to respond when someone says I love you. Speaking of Alexa, while we're on this topic, since this is something that maybe people in the audience have, there was just an announcement today from Amazon, for instance, that they're going to start selling an Echo that's aimed at children. I'm not sure if either of you guys saw this.
Oh, I didn't see this. It's interesting.
So it's a brightly colored small Echo Dot. And the thing that caught my attention that I found the most interesting is that if you're a parent, so I have a toddler, if you're a parent and you get one of these Echoes, you can program it to only answer to anyone in the house when the people in the house say please and thank you. Because otherwise, I mean, I have a toddler, he watches me interact with my Echo, and I'm often rude to it because it's not doing what I want. I'm like, play Madonna's 80s music. And then Amazon plays Madonna's 90s music. And I'm like, God, how dare you? And my son then is like, Alexa, play 80s music or whatever. And I'm like, oh, no, we never talk to anyone like that. And, to your point, Kate, like what kind of behavior we're patterning for people in reality, when we're interacting with an inanimate object, especially for children, is top of mind. And clearly this is something Amazon itself was thinking about, because now they're allowing you to demand politeness, which is a way of modeling good behavior for children. What do you make of that, and what do you make of the risks of how we interact with robots kind of influencing what is acceptable behavior even among humans?
Well, it's really good to hear that Amazon is thinking about this. I know a lot of people have come forward with similar stories where, their kid demands things of Alexa without saying please. And so there's a lot of concern there. And I think, there's some parallels here to the whole violence in video games debate where, we've talked about this for decades now. Is it harmful to people to play violent video games? And we don't really have that much evidence for it, but we've kind of decided, okay, it's probably better if kids don't do it. This is, equally hard to study, but I think it brings it to a new, more visceral level when we have these physical things. So like this guy, I've done workshops with these Pleos where we'll have people interact with them and name them, not kids, adults that know that it's it's just a robot, just a machine, and then we'll have them torture and kill them, and people freak out. And so we actually did some research, not with the dinosaurs, with much cheaper robots, where we were able to establish this connection between people's tendencies for empathy and how they're willing to treat a robot. And so we really do think that it might be a little bit muddled in people's subconscious, and that how we interact with these devices might actually influence how we interact with others. But we don't know, and we don't know if it's, if we take Westworld, the example, we don't know if Westworld is a really good thing for humanity to have, because if you have violent tendencies, you can just go to Westworld and beat the crap out of a robot and like do whatever you want, and then you can come back and be a really nice person. Or maybe you go and you get a taste for violence, and you get into the habit of like twisting people's arm a certain way, and then you come back and you accidentally do it to someone in a bar. And we have no idea what direction this goes in.
How do you test it?
Well, it's very hard to study, because you would need to study long-term how people's behavior changes. So it's something that I would like to try to get at. In the context of sex robots, it's basically impossible to study in the US.
For legal reasons?
Yeah. Well, you won't get funding for it. Okay. You'll be ostracized in academia, but also, so it's true, like no one will fund the research, but also I think, again, the most pressing issue, the one that I mentioned earlier about having child-sized sex robots, that one's impossible to study because you have reporting requirements in the US that make it so that it's impossible to get pedophiles to do your research on who haven't already been convicted of a crime, which is a very, specific subset. So there are some other countries working on this. Canada's doing some research, Germany's doing some research, but in the US it's impossible.
So this brings me to a question that is not as fun as some of the other questions we had, but was it yesterday? This week there was a terrorist attack in Canada, and the man who is alleged to have driven his truck into people on the street has been called an incel, which I'm not sure if you guys have read about, but to briefly explain, it's a group of people online who describe themselves as involuntary celibates. And they're all men, and they blame women for not sleeping with them. They say, like, women should, it's our duty as females to be servicing them, and they're not being serviced, and it's a hate group. And they have like these forums where they become more radicalized, and actually there have been I think there have been 2 other terrorist attacks in North America where the perpetrator was a member of this incel group. And I wonder if sex robots, I know this sounds ridiculous, but like, if we normalized access to sex robots, could we cure this problem of toxic lack of intimacy that becomes hatred?
That's interesting. So I think there are a lot of great uses for sex robots. I mean, if you look at the disabled community and their access to that type of intimacy, I think that sex robots have a lot of fantastic use cases like that. For this group of people, I wonder if it's a societal problem and not just
Not something that tech
access
can
to
fix.
sex. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know plenty of people who don't get any, and
And they're not an incel. Yeah, you're right. You're right. Damn, as a tech journalist, I'm always looking for the technology solution. Yeah, and I mean, I guess that I think intimacy with, the intimacy that we crave does sort of just get at larger societal issues, right? Of just we as humans crave intimacy, and now robots are another thing we can be intimate with.
And it brings up, I think, a really interesting point, which is, when you think about technology all the time, you're like, tech can fix this. And there's an impulse in a lot of communities that sort of think about this all the time and say, well, we've got an app for that.
Right.
And there's almost always sort of, we've got an app for that. And one of the real dangers that I worry about is that we get a little myopic about the role that a lot of artificial intelligence and anthropomorphized technologies can play when there are, lots, part of debates that have been going on for years and part of problems that have been going on for years. And so I think it's important when we talk about these things to try to properly contextualize them and say, are there things that where other alternatives won't work, right? Or maybe there's a different way.
Yeah. So what are some groups you mentioned, disabled people, Wired's coverage has mentioned elderly people for whom these kinds of assistant robots and even sex robots or intimacy robots, companion robots, can be so helpful. Who are these aimed at? Who do you think is going to be using them?
Well, I think the communities that you mentioned, I think the general consumer would be interested in having a sex robot.
Yeah.
Who here wants a sex robot? I do. Okay. But I do think that when we're talking about privacy and ethics, one thing that strikes me is that a lot of this technology that I see, not just sex technology, but generally these robots that we're talking about, these social robots, are being developed for very vulnerable parts of the population, the elderly, children, disabled people, and so it worries me twofold. I don't know how you feel about it, Woody. If you thought about the groups of people that are using this technology and their ability to advocate for their rights or to even understand what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
This is where a lot of the law sort of does actually start to get a little more serious and robust, is when you target populations that either have some sort of vulnerability or information asymmetry or some difficulty in assessing risk, right? So children are a really great example of this, where a lot of the reason why people, when you hear lawmakers that say, won't somebody think of the children?
Right.
A lot of the reason that is that they don't have the sort of body of knowledge to choose from, right? So even just the trial and error process that most adults have in trying to figure out, okay, well, if I do this, then it'll be okay, and if I do that, it's probably not going to be okay. And so I think that if we need rules anywhere, where I predict we'll get them first is with a lot of these populations that are at disadvantage when dealing with robots, or so might have some sort of deficit in terms of information asymmetries or possibly some sort of decision-making impairments. I think that's where you rules, because there are a lot of the rules that, particularly in the United States, when we're talking about these robots that are saying, well, listen, you're an adult. Here's some risks. You know what the risks are.
Yeah.
And if it blew up, you sort of knew what you were getting into.
Well, and the thing that strikes me so much with humanoid robots, or even robots that sound like humans, or robots that we can anthropomorphize, is that there's like twofold problem of, one, thinking you're interacting with a human when you're not. You're actually interacting with a company that programmed a human, and as you pointed out, has specific objectives of its own that you are not privy to. But then on the other hand, if you are able to remind yourself, like, no, that is not a human, that is a robot, there's a danger there as well, because we think of robots as objective in some true sense. And that's also not true. Like, just because it's not a human doesn't mean the robot itself is not programmed with biases.
Right.
AI biases that we can't see. And there's this again, this is another Amazon product, but there's this Echo Look device. Do you know about the Amazon Echo Look? It's an Amazon Echo with a video camera and a screen. And there's an app for it that will allow you to have the Amazon judge your outfits. And this is real. You can buy it today, right now. It's not that expensive. And you parade around in front of it, and you're like, should I wear this to the meeting? And the Echo is like, no, don't wear that. and I really worry. I really worry that who is actually saying no? And the answer is actually it's a group of Vogue editors assisted them in putting together the standards, but when you're a consumer interacting with these things, it can seem like it is just the truth from on high.
Yeah. The term that we've been using in our community is automation bias for people thinking, trusting the answers that they get from these algorithms.
Yeah.
And there's even been some really interesting work done on this. Madeline Ellish and Tim Wang, for example, have done some work showing that even with, airplanes have been largely automated for a while. They can pretty much autopilot themselves. And when something goes wrong, we always tend to blame the human and not the computer, even if it was clearly the machine's mistake. If there's a person to blame, we will blame the person because we trust the machines much more than we should. So I think you're right. It is a huge problem that we're not seeing behind the machine enough. We're not seeing that they're programmed by humans. And it strikes me that movie Her by Spike Jonze. Did everyone see that one? If you haven't, it's beautiful. It's not about robots. It's about love. But the thing that I kept the thing that I just kept wondering in this movie, which is about a guy who falls in love with an operating system because it has Scarlett Johansson's voice. So, and I won't spoil anything, but I kept wondering about exactly the scenario that you created with Mr. Spaghetti. What if the company was like, okay, we're going to cut off your access to this operating system unless you pay $10,000 for an upgrade? And he totally would have bought it. And it's very plausible that we would find ourselves in that situation because, again, it's the companies that have the agenda.
Yeah.
And that's not always in line with what we want or need.
And there are several problems that can really come from that. I mean, the fact that you bring up a great point, which is Ryan Calo and Kate Crawford call this the garbage in, garbage out problem, right? Which is, AI systems, which are increasingly going to be powering a lot of these robots, are trained on data. And that data is usually biased data, right? Because it's pulled from some sort of group that is not sort of representative or causes the machine to go in a way that if we were to know that direction, we would say that it's not wrong. But then the other thing I worry about, particularly as robots, we start to form relationships in robots that might start to take on the imprimatur of being an authority on something. So an education robot, for example, this is where automation bias becomes really problematic because if we have robot teacher, for example, right, you can imagine it's not that far-fetched to think that AI systems, because they can scale well, will be used to educate children.
Especially in a country where we don't pay teachers enough and we could be like, well, let's just have a robot do it.
That's right.
We don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. Now meet Alexa, your new teacher.
Yeah.
And there are the decision-making processes that result in the output of a lot of these AI systems are fraught with complexity and error. But we still will have a tendency to say, oh, well, if Alexa says it, then it's probably right. Or diagnostics machines, for example. There are lots of companies that are training artificial intelligence to become really actually quite good at diagnosis of various problems. And what happens when it sort of gets to the point where there's a conflict between what all the doctors say and what Dr. IBM Watson says,
Yeah.
and we then have a conflict, and people say, well, Watson got it right 99 out of 100 times, so surely this one's right.
I mean, we encounter this every single day. I encountered it on my way here to this event because it was raining in Boston, and I know that people forget how to drive when that happens, even though it rains like every single moment of our lives here. And so I put into Google, even though I knew how to get here, I put into Google to see what Google recommended was the best route for me. And even though I was like, that cannot possibly be the best route, and I know the best route, I wanted the confirmation from the machine that it was the best route.
That's right.
It's also tough because we've moved from this like interface where you can Google something and get a bunch of results and kind of sort through, which is problematic on its own because Google ranks it according to an algorithm. But we're moving to a world where you just ask Siri or Alexa and you get the top search result. Like you get one answer.
Yeah.
And what if that's the wrong answer?
Yeah, and what if the person giving that to you, what if the AI giving that to you looks like your best friend and lives in your house and you named it? Then you definitely will trust it more. So I have a question for you guys. How close are we to that reality? Like,
Wait, to which reality? The best friend one?
yeah, to the one where Alexa is, because 2 years ago I was looking at the humanoid robots that they had in a lab at MIT, and I watched one like try to open a door, fail 10 times, and then fall down some stairs. and I felt much better about life because I was like, I can walk much better than this robot. And it didn't seem like it was that close to being a reality. That I was gonna have a humanoid, like, because you can imagine, like, soon we could have like humanoid wait staff at a restaurant, or like doing jobs that like we don't want to do or something. So how close is that?
Oh my gosh. I mean, robots still can't open doors and they fall down all the time.
Okay, good.
but I think with clever design, like you don't have to make a humanoid. Like no one said that we had to recreate humans, which is very difficult to do. And in fact, it's not the most compelling use case for robotics because we already have humans who can do things. But if you create something like this, which looks like sort of like an animal, but not an animal that you've ever really interacted with before, and you give it some lifelike movements. I mean, this is a decade old, and it's like a toy and cheap. Like imagine what we can do today and create something that, it's not pretending to be a human. So I'm not disappointed by its behavior if it can't like open a door. Like I don't expect it to be able to open a door, but I can suspend my disbelief and even become emotionally attached to it because it's cute and I like it.
Yeah. Or even those like what are those white robots that they have at the malls?
Night
Security.
scope.
Yeah.
Yeah, the night scope.
And remember last year when one fell into a fountain?
Oh yeah.
And everybody on Twitter was like, the robot committed suicide.
Yeah.
And I was like, no, guys, that's not what happened. But I mean, one compelling use case one necessitating factor for a humanoid form factor is sex, right? I mean, at least I've been imagining.
Have you been in a sex shop? Because they have walls of dildos that look nothing like, I think they look nothing like an actual, no, you're right though. Like right now, the current market for sex robots is very humanoid. That's true.
Okay.
But I think that we're still a ways away from Westworld.
Yeah.
A long. I think all in this room be dead before we get to sort of
thank
Westworld
God.
territory. But I think that we're relatively close to single task, human-like robots. So, for example, you can imagine. We're seeing this on Twitter now, where you could create an army of humanoid.
Sorry, we're ignoring you.
Do you want me to turn him off?
No,
I like him.
I love Mr. Spaghetti.
Sorry.
I'm emotionally attached to Mr. Spaghetti now. Can't help myself. But so we're really close, and we're seeing this right now to being able to create Twitter bots that are just convincing enough to cause you to agree with that thing that you wanted to agree with in the first place, right? Like these 2,000 Twitter bots agree with me, so now I'm even more confident in my decision, to support XYZ, right? And so we're going to see. I think that those single-use sort of applications are closer.
Man, okay, well, so we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. But I guess before we do that, I just wanted to ask you guys: are there any concerns about these robots that we didn't cover? That
There's one.
okay.
These robots are, and one that I didn't mention, but it's worth thinking about, are going to use facial recognition technologies and other biometric technologies. That is something that keeps me up at night because we really have pretty weak rules around that. And facial recognition technology is an incredibly powerful technology that I think we're just starting to grapple with. And if these things take off, I think you can imagine that technology would come along with it. So I would just encourage everyone to sort of think critically about the role of biometrics with these robots.
Yeah, I actually have a friend who there's like a problem with iPhones. iPhones right now have facial recognition technology, like the new ones, to unlock. And my friend's 9-month-old looks enough like her that he unlocks it.
No.
And when she told me that, I actually didn't believe it. I was like, that's just, can't possibly be true. But I watched it happen. And then actually a lot of people have reported, now it's like a known bug, that people whose children look like, genetically enough like them can fool it. Which, imagine if your sex robot was set to only unlock to your face, but then your child came in and looked at it and unlocked. I mean, I'm just saying. Okay. And with that, let's go to some questions.
Great. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone.
Yeah, the people will be coming down with microphones and...
So we have our first question here to your right.
Oh.
Hello, guys.
Hi.
Well, my name is Javier, and I have a question. It's more related with what do you think it's more important to work on in the laws or in the education of the user?
So is your question whether it's more important to get better laws or should we channel our efforts into educating users?
Yes.
I think the answer is both. I think that the laws need to change to make sure that we're not asking too much of users. So one of the things that concerns me a lot about privacy law in general is that it's all based on this idea that we could somehow possibly completely assess all the risks of using a technology. Anyone here or that we ask too much of them, how many people here have 75 different passwords that you have to change on a regular basis and make sure it's got a special character and, all these other things? And so when we use a simple password, right, we've got so many different password requirements, we use, Go Red Sox as our password, and then, everyone makes fun of the user when we get hacked, like, oh, you idiot, you shouldn't have used Go Red Sox. What did you want people to do, right? We've got 45 different passwords we've got to manage. And so I think the key is to make sure that we're all educated about risk, but to make sure that the laws aren't situated in such a way that it demands too much of people so that failure to be educated punishes them.
Next question to your left.
So I have a few friends who do research into the mathematics of data privacy. Are there any really good frameworks for making sure that you actually can simultaneously learn from users while also not learning too much about them? I know that it's really, really easy, for example, to see from 5 pieces of data on somebody's Netflix account and figure out exactly who they are. So are there strong models out there, either legal or mathematical, for how to make it so that somebody who works at the sex robot company can't just figure out who you are and what you like and be creepy?
Well, I mean, ideally, it would all just happen on the robot itself.
Yeah.
And not, but that's unrealistic because unfortunately, we're going in the direction where, AI is learning from these massive, massive data sets. The more data, the better. So it's kind of unrealistic to do that locally, have that type of data collection and processing. But ideally, you would do as much of it locally as you can and anonymize it. But really, I think that we're screwed. I don't have a good answer. I hope that your friends do.
Well, so Kate, I was actually thinking about how porn through history has driven a lot of innovation and a lot of technological innovation, with movies and all sorts of things and cameras. And one thing that is ubiquitous in the use of porn right now is the private browsing mode.
Oh yeah,
People will go into private browsing mode so that they're not sending back their porn habits to people. Is there going to be an equivalent of that with sexual robots?
Maybe. I mean, so I actually know there are people in the porn industry who made a really good privacy browser that's much better than the ones. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. It's called Tenta or something.
Okay.
I know this because I did a project on the porn industry once. So I met a lot of people.
They're really interesting. Wired writes about, I mean, Pornhub is like one of the most interesting data sets that you can look at.
It is. Yeah, I don't know. Will there be something like that? But again, that puts the that's kind of like the user needs to.
Yeah. So first of all, everyone should know that incognito mode doesn't actually completely protect you. It just keeps people from that are also using your computer from knowing what you did. But of course, your information still goes out to the ISP.
Yeah,
it still goes to
for the regular
services.
browsers.
Right.
For this browser, it does not.
Oh, okay.
Because the porn industry knows, and it's in their interests that you can keep your privacy protected.
Right. Of course. Yeah. Absolutely. And to the question about whether there'll be a technology sort of mathematically, I think the answer is going to be there will be certain uses. So there's a concept known as differential privacy, which some people may have heard of, that's promising under certain use cases. There's distributed computing possibilities that are being experimented with right now. I think that the answer to this problem is not going to be one technology or one approach will save us. It will probably be a combination of technologies with good policies, with being able to actually trust people. At the end of the day, we still need to be able to trust companies and people that are building these technologies.
Great. We have our next question here in the back of the house.
I was very piqued when I heard you say that there wouldn't be a good business case for building a robot that was better at doing human tasks or better at being a human. And I started running it in my head, like, what's a human task? So my question is, can you make a robot that's maybe, I don't know, a better politician than a human could be? Or better at sex, better at love, better at writing poetry, directing movies. Is it possible? Can they replace us? Like, really replace the human tasks?
I mean, so robots are, don't get me wrong, robots and AI are already much, much better than us at certain things. They're getting incredibly good at specific tasks. They can beat us at chess, beat us at Go, beat us at Jeopardy. I forget, did Watson win that one? I forget.
Yeah,
but for sure, individual tasks. What robots and AI are really bad at is things like understanding context or task switching into a different environment. Or understanding, like you can show an AI, my friend Gary Marcus always makes this example, you can show an AI 100,000 pictures of a glass of water, and it will be able to recognize a glass of water, but you can show Emily's 2.5-year-old a glass of water and say, this is a glass of water, and the 2.5-year-old will understand the concept of a glass of water. So our intelligence is far, far superior in a lot of ways. So I really do think that rather than trying to recreate human intelligence, I really like the animal analogy where we've used animals that are better than us at certain things throughout history to help us achieve what we want to achieve and use them as partners. And I think that that's the killer use case for robots and AI too, is trying to think of them as supplements to our abilities rather than just trying to recreate what we can already do.
Next question in the center section.
Hi, so I want to go back to something you said earlier around these robots really being extensions of other people's kind of motivations, and to the extent where that we might have privacy considerations with that. So one of the things that is really big right now from a design perspective is behavior change. And this is specifically important within the medical community.
Right.
So I know, for instance, there's already an elder robot that helps you make sure you take your pills on time.
Right.
And similarly, there are going to be other robots you can imagine that are trying to get you to do certain behaviors because they and society at large thinks it's in your best interest. What sort of ethics guidelines and/or legal protections exist already for this idea of a group of people who might be now acting through this robot to trying to get you to do something they think is in your best interest?
It depends on the context, actually, right? So the way in which a lot of the laws are created are very context specific. If it's medically related, we've got a group of laws. If it's financially related, we've got a group of laws. And there are, and a lot of this actually may be where consent matters, right? And maybe where consent actually is really actually critical, because some people might buy a robot for the specific purpose of having the robot say, I see you reaching for that cigarette.
Yeah.
I'm so disappointed in you, right? And you're like, oh, you're right, you know. And so I think that's maybe a more promising framework for some of these like singular cases of, you know, I want this sort of paternalistic, sort of paternalistic type behavior. And then, but otherwise, if it's for good, right? And then I'll put like who picks for what good is, then there's going to be, I think we're just starting the debate about how far companies can go in forcing people to do good things in the absence of some sort of rule, right?
Great. Next question here in the back of the house.
Hi. So how long until robots are protected in the same way that like animals are protected from animal abuse or something like that? Like, it could be a traumatic thing to, hit a robot with a bat in front of a kid who's in love with it or something, you know? And
Yeah, it would. I mean, yeah. I don't think that we're anywhere close to having robots that inherently deserve some kind of protection because they're as smart as us or whatnot, or as smart as animals even. But I do think that societally we might get to a point in the near medium term future where it is disturbing to us to see these very lifelike creatures be mistreated. I just said creatures. These very lifelike devices be mistreated. So, there might be a societal push to not have that happen generally anymore because it could traumatize children and whatnot. And there might also be an argument for it if it turns out that it is desensitizing to people to be violent towards these very lifelike things, like in Westworld. Like if we had a Westworld and people who go to Westworld and then come back home end up, becoming abusive to their kids or pets at home, then we would actually want laws that protect robots when really it's about, restricting our own behavior to protect other humans.
And I'd add that what you'll likely see first, and I don't know if Kate agrees with me or not, is you probably won't see laws out of the gate. You'll probably see some sort of soft form of law, right? So if a robot, if you're given a robot as part of your work, part of the contract may be you can't abuse the robot, right?
Yeah.
Or like if we deem this societally acceptable, then it may be sort of a ground up, there's a business that takes the lead in advocating for decency towards robots, for example, right? And then if that doesn't work, then maybe then we would see some rules.
Yeah, I think we're already starting to see some social norms around it, just a little bit, kind of jokingly, but not really. Like there are a bunch of YouTube videos of people torturing these things. Or other robots. Yeah, someone just said, "Oh, yeah." So the comments are strikingly polarized when you go and watch these videos because some people are like, "This is horrible. Whoever did this should be locked up," and other people are like, "Haha, it's funny. Robot gets beaten up," and so it's like you already see a lot of people who are not comfortable with this type of thing happening.
I mean, it's really a question about the human condition. Like if you're predisposed to want to enact violence on something that is like a being, like there's an argument that it's better that you do it to something that isn't a real being.
True, unless it
encourages
you to do it more. Like if you kick the robot dog 5 times, are you more likely to kick your actual dog? And we don't know if that's true. It could be an outlet, or it could be. Yeah, it's messy.
Next question in the front row.
Hi. While we wait for the law and regulations to catch up, and while we wait for companies and hope that companies will be more mindful of with our interests in mind, what one tip or suggestion may you leave the audience with tonight that we might be able to act on to better protect ourselves?
Well, I'll start with one. Just if you have any Internet of Things devices in your home, of which, as Woody was pointing out, these will be a part, change your default password. Because some of these are, have okay security and some have terrible security. And for instance, like internet-connected baby monitors, which are really popular, so that you can have a baby monitor in your kid's room and then it goes to your smartphone. So then you can even be looking at your kid there's a babysitter in your house or whatever, a lot of those monitors came with a default password of like the word password, which is, really easy to hack, and then puts you and your child at risk for all sorts of ways, and is how like the botnet last year took over the Internet of Things. So just number one, that would be my tip, but there's probably others.
I would also say if control is the dominating narrative right now, we want to give you control, then use it to the extent you can. Don't just change passwords, but also like flip every setting. How many sort of green buttons can you turn to gray on your iPhone, and push back, right? And I think the bigger thing that we can all do is take a second and realize that the shiny new thing is very exciting, but with every shiny new thing we take on, there's going to be a certain amount of risk. And I think merely being more conscientious in general is probably a net better for everyone.
Yeah, it's hard though. I mean, I'm the first to admit I haven't deleted Facebook yet because I just had a baby and like all the parenting groups are on Facebook, and so it's really hard to give up that functionality. But yeah, I would just echo, the privacy settings aspect. You can go through, you can try to be as informed as possible, try to understand what these systems are doing with your data, and that's the best we can do for now.
Great. Next question here in the center.
Yes, you mentioned keeping it informed. What sources would you suggest that we can go to monitor these threats? I'll tell you, I'm glad I'm as old as I am. I'm more and more comfortable knowing that I will take up residence in the Forest Hill Cemetery, at some time. But, I have a daughter and granddaughter, so my concern is not so much for myself, but for my family and their families.
I mean, I would say, first of all, I think young people are perhaps the first people to understand the risks of these things, and your granddaughter, or in some ways, your granddaughter may be understanding this. There was a really great article in the New York Times that I wished I had written, and the New York Times is one good resource. Wired also has a security section that I recommend you read. We cover this nonstop. But New York Times had a really great piece about children who were saying to their parents, stop putting my photos on Instagram and Facebook. I didn't tell you could share my image on social media, and I want to be in charge of my image. And I was really heartened by that because I think, and also sobered because I'm a parent who puts my son on Instagram. And I think that there is this sort of digital first generation growing up, and they are both more comfortable with these devices because they're like part of their lives, but also kind of understand the privacy risks in a deep way that we, who have had a whole life of privacy before they came around, are actually catching up to them.
The where I come out on all of this is, and to add to sort of what can we do as people, the thing that we can do is realize that there's only so much that we can do, which means that we have to demand change from other levers of power, right? So one of the things we can do is when people are running for office, ask them what their stance is on privacy and data security and automation issues, right? So these are going to, if they're not already, I mean, they are already, but they certainly will be political issues. And so find organizations that fight for the causes that you believe in. So there are many tech policy organizations, the ACLU, the EFF, the Center for Democracy and Technology, and Electronic Privacy Information Center. All of these organizations, you can sort of join a lot of their efforts because just being informed, sadly, isn't enough.
Very good point.
Another way to inform yourself, because he's being too modest, is Woody has a book out. Yes. Which you haven't mentioned once. You're really bad at promoting
I am bad
this.
at plugging my own book. I wrote a book on all the different things that you can do to protect your privacy.
And it's called, tell us what it's called.
Privacy's Blueprint, the battle to control the design of new technologies.
There we go.
There you go.
Thanks. Thank you.
Next question in the back of the house.
Hi. What is your opinion on the robot Sophia, and what are the implications, if any, about giving a robot citizenship?
Well, I think that was mostly just a PR stunt that worked. It got tons of press.
Kate, can you tell me what it is? 'Cause I don't know about it. Somehow I missed it.
Sophia is this very humanoid, lifelike looking female robot that Saudi Arabia gave citizenship to.
Oh.
Yes. And it's, quite interesting that it was Saudi Arabia, given that women don't have many rights there generally. But also it just, I think in part because of that, but also because, they were giving this robot citizenship, just generated a ton of media attention, and I think that's what they were aiming for. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't think that robots are anywhere close to deserving this type of right, and I don't think that this is going to be a trend. I think it was a gimmick and not, the sign that we're going to start giving robots citizenship. But it is possible in the far, far future robots that are, intelligent enough that they may deserve some sort of right. And my sense is that by that time we'll be living in a world that looks very different, that looks different legally, that looks different, from our relationship to technology. We'll probably have a lot more of human enhancement and have dealt with the cyborg issue and what does it mean to be human long before we ever have humanoid robots that actually deserve citizenship rights. So I'm not too sure how to have that conversation now. What it would look like.
I would just add, this relates in some ways to that case of the monkey selfie. You're familiar with this case?
Naruto?
Yeah, exactly. So there's a monkey that took a picture of itself, and then that picture went viral, and then animal rights activists have been suing to give the monkey legal standing to own the copyright, which sounds like a superfluous, silly thing, but actually would be set a legal precedent that the monkey was worthy or deserving of legal rights under the law. And just, I think today, they found again, for the third time, that the monkey has no standing. So if we're not, as a society, ready to give a monkey that is smart and is able to take a camera it's never seen before and take a photo of itself, if we're not ready to give that being that is actually alive any rights, we're far from giving robots.
Yeah, and I'll just add, as a matter of terminology really quickly, it's worth sort of siphoning off that there are really two different kinds of rights when we say, do robots have rights? There's the citizenship right is what we call a positive right, it's a thing that I get to enforce on the world. And that, I totally agree with Kate's analysis. It's sort of like saying, I give you the right to do magic, right? And you're like, okay, well, I don't really know sort of what to do with that. But the kind of rights that Kate's been talking about for a while in a lot of her research, and that I think that we would see sooner, much sooner than we saw a positive right, is what people call a negative right, which is basically a rule saying you can't do something to somebody else, right? So it's not a right inherent to the thing, but it's a protection that other people can't do things to the robot, right? So it's more restrictions on other people. And I could see restrictions as a sort of negative right? So when we use that word right, I could see that sort of happening maybe a little sooner.
Great. So we'll have our final question here to your right.
I have a very quick aside, but you're talking about getting here and looking at your maps. I actually looked at Apple Maps and I didn't believe it. And I looked at Google Maps and I was like, okay, that seems more in line. I trusted one over the other, even though they're using the same information. But that's not my question. My question is talking about, the terrorist attack and people looking into into social media, looking at blog posts, thinking about when someone is accused of a crime, going and getting their computer and the rules that are around passwords and phones. If you have someone who's accused of some sort of domestic violence, what are the law ramifications around, like, did Alexa pick up something in the house of, someone screaming at their spouse, or maybe the way they treated their sex robot?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that, I'm just interested in that perspective.
Yeah.
So, generally speaking, I think that the interesting thing to take away from a lot of this is that the same legal regimes that apply to computers are going to apply to sex robots in the exact same way, right?
Yeah.
So if there was information on your computer, then and barring some sort of argument that robots are somehow unique. And I think that that's an interesting question to think about the ways in which robots are unique. Then our operating presumption is that all these same rules will indeed apply. And we should take that into consideration when considering how to adopt them and how they should be built.
There's also a really great movie called Robot and Frank.
Oh my God, it's the best.
It's
really
not
good.
a lot of people know it, even though it has like an all-star cast and everything. It's a really, really good movie that gets at some of these issues.
It's so great.
Agreed.
You should see it.
Well, thank you guys so
Thank
much.
you.
What an amazing, amazing conversation. We are so lucky to have access to people like this in Boston.
Thanks for having us.
And I want to reiterate that, yes, Woody has a new book. It's just come out
Sorry, I
in the
should've done
last week or two. It's called Privacy's Blueprint, The Battle to Control the Design of New Technologies. And it will be for sale right after this on the stage, and he will be available to sign your book, which is really a juicy little detail. And we congratulate you on that. So thank you guys so much for coming. We hope that you will sign up and become part of our adult programs posse. You can sign up over there, grab one of the brochures and see what we've been doing, and come back again another day. Thanks so much.